For most people of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the grand facade of a plantation home represented wealth, order, and civility. But behind the polished windows and manicured porches, an entirely different world existed, one shaped by invisible labor, rigid hierarchies, and human survival. It was in this hidden world that house servants, enslaved African men and women, lived out their days, often in silence. I'm truly glad to welcome you to the Glorious Historian channel. Tell us in the comments, from which country are you watching us? Like this video if this content speaks to you, and subscribe to our channel to get notified about new releases. Enjoy watching, your presence here matters. House servants were seen as more privileged than field hands, but this illusion of privilege came at a heavy price. These men and women lived in close proximity to their enslavers, constantly watched, judged, and demanded upon. Their clothing may have been less tattered than that of field workers, but their burdens were uniquely psychological. They had to navigate the most intimate spaces of white households, dressing their owners, preparing meals, raising their children, all while hiding their own pain, hunger, or grief. A young woman named Ebony, sold into slavery at age 14, found herself inside such a house in coastal South Carolina. The year was 1792. She rose each day before dawn to light the kitchen hearth, often with nothing more than stale cornmeal in her stomach. She swept floors that never seemed clean enough, polished silver that wasn't hers, and washed linens she could never rest beneath. Despite her silence, Ebony noticed everything. She observed how the mistress flinched when her husband raised his voice. She saw the hidden letters the daughter wrote to a northerner. She smelled the scent of rum on the master's breath before dinner, and how he would stagger past the quarters late at night. Ebony's position in the house made her invisible, and yet privy to everything. The presence of enslaved servants in the home blurred lines of privacy and power. While plantation owners believed themselves to be in control, it was often the house servants who knew the rhythms of the household best. They understood who would be angry, who would be ill, and when tension was brewing. But knowledge was not safety, it was another burden, locked behind quiet eyes and bowed heads. Even when meals were served, Ebony could not eat. Even when laughter echoed in the parlor, she could not laugh. Her job was to maintain an illusion, that the house ran smoothly on its own. That everything was in its right place. That no human cost was behind the polished glass or glowing chandeliers. House servants didn't just clean rooms or carry trays, they became unwilling students of a world built to exclude them. From the edge of rooms where they weren't meant to be noticed, they learned to read faces, decipher tones, and anticipate danger. Every gesture, every sigh from their enslavers carried meaning, and could alter the course of a servant's day. Tommy, a young boy of 12, had been brought into the house as a dining attendant. Each evening, he was tasked with preparing the long oak table, aligning every utensil with near-perfect precision. But his true education happened not with forks and knives, but in the words spoken around that table. Whispers about land deals, disputes with neighboring plantations, family scandals, all passed through the air as if he were invisible. He noticed when the master's voice dropped, it meant bad weather or bad business. When the mistress left a napkin unfolded, it meant she was ill. Tommy had become fluent in the language of silence. But there were dangers in noticing too much. One evening, he dropped a silver goblet when startled by an argument in the next room. Though the cup was unbroken, he was struck with a cane and left in a storage room for a night without food. No apology came, just a reminder, you see nothing. You hear nothing. You are nothing. Yet even in this cruel environment, some enslaved people formed quiet bonds. The cook, Aunt Sella, would save scraps of meat for Tommy when she could. In whispered prayers before dawn, older women in the laundry room reminded each other of dignity, of ancestors who once walked freely under African skies. House servants found resilience in stolen moments, the hush of early morning, the glance of solidarity between tasks, the murmur of a song hummed while scrubbing floors. These moments didn't erase their pain, but they offered something that could not be bought or whipped away, memory, and the will to endure. Ebony, now nearly 17, began to notice these invisible connections. A glance shared with Tommy when he passed her the polishing cloth. A smile from Aunt Sella as she tucked a biscuit under a folded apron. Even in a house designed to isolate them, enslaved people created threads of kinship, quiet threads, but unbreakable. It was in these small, defiant acts, a glance, a song, a prayer, that a deeper education took root. It was an education in survival, in hope, and in remembering who they were, even as the world tried to make them forget. To serve inside the house was to live under constant scrutiny. While field laborers toiled under the open sky, house servants existed under the ceiling of white expectation, and punishment often came not from action, but from perceived attitude. A frown, a pause too long before answering, or a slightly uneven hem in a garment could trigger accusations of defiance. Ebony had grown skilled in emotional concealment. Every morning, as she dressed the mistress in imported muslins and adjusted her corset strings, she bit her tongue against exhaustion and bruised fingers. When the mistress complained of headaches, Ebony was expected to fetch herbs and prepare tea without being told. When guests arrived, she had to anticipate their needs before they spoke. She was praised not for who she was, but for how effectively she disappeared into her function. Despite her silence, Ebony was constantly reminded of her place. The mistress would sometimes say, "You're not like the others, you're clever." But this wasn't praise. It was a warning, don't step out of line. Being clever in the wrong moment could lead to suspicion or worse. She shared a cramped attic room with two other young house slaves, both girls only slightly younger than she. The room held 3 straw mattresses, a broken cabinet, and a single cracked window that barely let in air. At night, they whispered stories from their pasts, their mothers' voices echoing in memory. Sometimes, they sang songs in low voices, lullabies that carried pieces of their stolen homelands. One evening, the master's brother, a man known for his cruelty, came to visit. Ebony was ordered to prepare the guest room. She laid out clean linens, lit the oil lamp, and left quickly. But hours later, he called for her again. Her stomach dropped. Aunt Sella quietly took her arm and said, "If you don't come back right away, I'll make noise in the kitchen." Ebony returned unharmed that night, thanks to Aunt Sella's protective instincts. But she understood more deeply than ever, proximity to power did not mean safety, it often meant danger. And protection, when it came only from each other. Even within the grand walls of the plantation house, with its chandeliers and polished banisters, the air was thick with unspoken rules and threats. House servants were expected to be silent, obedient, invisible. But they were not fools. They learned to read every glance, every shift in tone, every drop of change in the air. That was the cost of survival. There was a language spoken in the grand house that had nothing to do with words. It moved in glances, in the subtle shuffle of slippers down polished hallways, in the rhythm of footsteps that carried expectations or punishments. House servants had to learn it like survival itself, because it was. Tommy, now entering his teenage years, began to recognize this unspoken dialect. The creak of the stair meant the master was pacing, usually before a fit of rage. The sharp ring of a bell meant someone had fallen out of favor. The soft clearing of the mistress's throat signaled impatience, delay could cost dearly. He also learned to listen between words. When guests laughed too loudly, it was often forced, a sign that something was wrong in the household. When the mistress asked, "Where is that boy?" in a certain tone, it wasn't a question, it was a threat. Yet the most dangerous moments were when silence filled the house. That silence could mean illness, grief, or anger being held just beneath the surface. During those times, Tommy and the other servants moved like shadows, stepping lighter, breathing quieter. There were allies in this world of signs. The butler, Mr. Lem, an older man who had long endured in the house, taught the younger boys small tricks: how to sense when a candle had burned just enough to justify replacing it, how to judge the mood of the master by the placement of his walking stick by the door. Mr. Lem had a sharp eye, and his instruction wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. "Respect the walls," he once whispered to Tommy. "They've seen everything. And they never forget." Downstairs in the scullery, Ebony too became fluent in the household's codes. She knew the mistress would always call for lemon water in the late morning, especially after receiving letters from her northern relatives. Those letters always brought a sourness to her mood, and sometimes, that sourness spilled over onto the servants. She taught the newer housemaids how to fold napkins in a fan shape, how to clean crystal glass without leaving a single smudge. But most of all, she would say, learn to see things before they're asked for. That's the only way to stay ahead of punishment. This was the cruel irony of house service. They were closer to the enslavers than others, even brushing their hair, dressing their children, but never further from being seen as human. The better they served, the more invisible they became. Still, within this invisible world, the enslaved carved spaces for pride. A perfectly laid table. A wrinkle-free curtain. A polished banister that gleamed like glass. These weren't just chores, they were survival, dignity, quiet mastery in a world that denied them everything. Living inside the main house brought a different kind of danger, the constant proximity to power. Unlike field slaves who labored under the open sky and suffered visible brutality, house servants lived under constant scrutiny, where a misstep meant emotional humiliation or cruel punishment delivered in silence, behind closed doors. Tommy learned that no act was too small to be punished. Once, he left a chair slightly askew after dusting the parlor. The master walked in, looked around, and without a word, slapped Tommy so hard he fell. No one said anything. The chair was corrected. The house swallowed the moment. There was always a performance. House servants were part of the scenery, they had to be helpful, pleasant, and most of all, invisible. They were expected to be nearby, but never too close. To move quickly, but not rush. To serve attentively, but never speak unless spoken to. And even then, to speak softly. Ebony once explained it to Tommy like this: they want us near enough to use, but far enough not to feel guilty. The kitchen was the only space where house servants could breathe without acting. Even there, though, the walls listened. When the master or mistress entered the room, conversations ended mid-sentence. Eyes dropped. Smiles vanished. Tommy began to observe the hierarchy even among the enslaved. The butler had seniority. The cook wielded respect. Young boys like him fetched coal, cleaned boots, or stood silently in rooms where he barely understood what was being said. He hated the way guests looked through him. As if he were a shadow. Yet sometimes that invisibility gave him power. He overheard things, arguments about money, whispered rumors about abolition, and the private lives of the white family he served. There was a quiet intelligence that house servants developed. They read faces, footsteps, body language. They adjusted before being told. A moment's misjudgment could mean punishment, or being sent back to the fields. And still, moments of strange tenderness would surface. Once, the mistress handed Tommy a half-eaten biscuit without a word. He knew better than to thank her. Gratitude could be dangerous. It could be interpreted as sarcasm. Another time, a guest's child, too young to understand cruelty, clung to Ebony's hand and called her "Mama" before being scolded and pulled away. Ebony said nothing, but later, Tommy saw her sitting in the kitchen, still holding the child's glove like it was a piece of her own heart. These contradictions, cruelty one hour, kindness the next, made everything more confusing. House service wasn't safety. It was walking a razor's edge in polished shoes. In the quiet corners of the house, away from the glint of silverware and the echo of laughter, Tommy and Ebony held on to their humanity through small acts of care, a shared crust of bread, a knowing glance, a story whispered at night. That, they knew, the master could never own. Tommy soon learned that walls in the house were thinner than they looked, and not just for sound. They held secrets, whispered instructions, arguments, and betrayals. What couldn't be said in front of guests or in daylight hours was often spoken in low tones late at night, when most had gone to bed, except the servants. One night, while delivering clean linens to the upper floor, Tommy overheard the master arguing with a visitor about debts. The voices were sharp, then low, then angry again. Words like "sell the boy" and "New Orleans" were clear. He froze behind a door, linen bundle trembling in his hands. That night, he didn't sleep. He whispered what he heard to Ebony, who held his hand tight. "We don't panic," she said softly, "we prepare." They began hiding bread scraps. Just in case. Every day felt like the edge of a cliff. One wrong move and you might be sold, your life packed into a cart, your name erased. And in a house where every movement was watched, wrong moves were easy to make. But there were alliances too. Among the servants, quiet loyalty bloomed. They shared unspoken signals, a nod here, a glance there, warnings when the mistress was in a foul mood or the overseer prowled the halls. These small acts of solidarity were a form of rebellion, quiet but defiant. Mrs. Lane, a fellow housemaid, was one of the oldest. She wore her silence like armor. But when Tommy forgot to sprinkle lavender water on the bedsheets, a detail that could have earned him a whipping, she stepped in, quickly covering for him. Later, in the laundry room, she simply said, "Pay attention, little one. They notice the scent before they notice you." At the edge of this delicate world was the danger of being noticed too much, or not at all. Both were punishments in different clothes. Tommy once made eye contact with the master's teenage son, a mistake. For days, he was watched, followed. One night, he found a dead mouse on his sleeping mat, a silent threat. He never looked up again. One afternoon, a visitor mistook Ebony for a guest and asked her a question. Before she could answer, the mistress appeared and slapped her across the face in front of everyone. "She doesn't speak unless spoken to," the mistress barked. The visitor laughed. Ebony bled. But still, in the quiet hours before sunrise, the servants would sometimes sit near the hearth and share stories from home, tales of rivers that sang, spirits that protected, and families long lost. It reminded them of who they were before their names were taken. Before the house told them who to be. And in that house of polished silver, lace curtains, and heavy rules, those whispers became their truth. Not the rules. Not the lashes. Not even the master's voice. But their own, quiet, steady, still alive. The rhythm of the house never stayed the same for long. New rules arrived with every guest, every letter from the city, every change of season. For the enslaved, it meant that safety was always temporary, and danger could appear without warning. One week, Tommy was helping polish silverware when the master's sister arrived from Charleston. She demanded new uniforms for the house staff, brighter aprons, matching turbans, shoes, even for the younger ones. She told the mistress, appearances matter in society, as if the enslaved were decorations. Tommy and Ebony were measured, stitched, and dressed, all without being asked. But the shoes blistered their feet, and the tight turbans gave headaches. They smiled when guests were near. Later, behind the pantry door, they wiped sweat and swallowed back pain. The new uniforms also came with new punishments. If a turban sat crooked or an apron had dust, it meant no supper. One boy was made to stand outside in the rain all night for dirty cuffs. The next morning, he shivered through breakfast service, his lips blue. Still, the house remained full of beauty, but never for them. Paintings hung in every room, rivers, swans, grand houses. Tommy once asked Ebony, "Why don't they ever paint us?" She replied, "Because they want to believe we're not really here." One afternoon, a young servant girl, Mima, tripped while carrying tea to the mistress's guest. The tray shattered. Mima stood frozen, trembling. Before the mistress could rise, her guest, a pale-haired woman in a yellow gown, knelt beside the girl and gently touched her shoulder. "It's all right," the guest said softly. "She's only a child." For a brief moment, the room stood still. Then the mistress forced a smile. That night, Mima wasn't punished, but the mistress threw out the china set, calling it tainted. Kindness, when it came, was unexpected and fragile. Another morning, Tommy found a small note tucked inside the pages of a discarded newspaper in the hallway. It read, "Hold on. You are not forgotten." He never found out who left it. But he kept it hidden in the cuff of his sleeve for months, rereading it in secret. These fleeting moments, a soft word, a hidden message, a guest's brief decency, did not change their status. But they reminded the servants that they were human, and seen, if only for a second. The rest of the time, they remained background, like the rugs beneath rich shoes or the windows that let in light but were never opened for them. Still, Tommy held on to that note like a piece of the world that hadn't been stolen yet. Life as a house servant meant living in the silence between rooms, in the spaces where voices were not meant to carry, but always did. The house breathed through whispers, the scrape of chairs on wood floors, the rustle of skirts, the echo of laughter that never belonged to the enslaved. Tommy learned early to listen, not just to obey, but to survive. The family spoke freely around them, as if the servants were furniture. From this, Tommy knew who quarreled over money, which cousin drank too much, and which guests to avoid after dark. One night, while dusting the study, he overheard the master whispering to a man with a long coat. "If things go south," the master said, "we'll sell off 4, maybe 6. Start with the girl who sings." Tommy's heart pounded. He knew who they meant. Ebony often sang under her breath while hanging laundry, soft songs from her childhood, songs that reminded her of the river where her mother once washed clothes. The thought of Ebony being taken shook him. He said nothing, but that night he warned her in the hallway by the lampstand, pretending to adjust her apron. "Stop singing. Just for now." She looked at him and nodded once. Her voice was silent for weeks. There were other dangers too, ones whispered from servant to servant in brief moments between chores. "Don't go near the master's brother alone. Don't wear red when the mistress is upset. Stay quiet when the judge comes to visit." These were rules never written, but followed like law. Tommy once passed the drawing room where the mistress sat alone, her face hidden behind a fan. A servant girl had been sold that morning. The mistress hadn't protested. But now, in the quiet, she sat in a chair without moving for over an hour. Tommy thought, maybe guilt sounded like silence. Some white visitors were worse than others. A few treated the servants with cold formality. Others ignored them entirely. But once in a while, someone asked a name or gave a servant something small, a leftover biscuit, a second blanket, a glance that said, "I see you." It was never enough. But it was something. The walls of the house were thin, but the lives of those within were even thinner, stretched between duty and danger, silence and sight. Ebony once said, "We're ghosts in their world, unless they want something. Then we're bodies again." It was a truth they all carried, hidden like the calluses on their hands. Yet still, they whispered to one another. They shared knowledge like breadcrumbs, left behind for the next person to follow, so maybe they wouldn't fall into the same traps. And every night, they slept light, ears tuned to creaking steps, distant sobs, or the sound of the kitchen door opening, never knowing what change tomorrow's whispers would bring. The mansion was always spotless, not because the family was clean, but because dozens of hands worked in silence to make it so. Every morning before sunrise, the house servants were already moving, polishing brass, sweeping ash from the fireplaces, ironing dresses that weren't theirs. Ebony became responsible for setting the dining room. Each fork, knife, and plate had to be aligned with mathematical precision. A misplaced spoon could invite fury, and the mistress's anger was ice-cold, delivered in whispers sharp as glass. Once, a wrinkle in a tablecloth led to Ebony scrubbing floors for 2 days without pause. But worse was the smile, the tight, forced smile the mistress gave to guests while her hand gripped Ebony's arm just out of view. For many of the house servants, every task had layers of danger. Mistakes were not tolerated, but perfection brought no praise, only higher expectations. One girl, Isoke, was so good at polishing silver that she was made to do it for the entire estate. Her hands bled from the harsh soap, but she dared not slow down. There was a strange dignity in this invisible labor. Each movement was a strategy, each glance a calculation. The servants learned how to step soundlessly on the old floorboards, which doors creaked, which guests to avoid. Tommy was tasked with cleaning the master's boots. They had to shine like mirrors, though they often came caked with mud. Once, he forgot to finish the left boot before the master's midday ride. That evening, he was locked in the smokehouse overnight. He came out coughing blood. They were punished not just for disobedience, but for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. A broken vase once led to 3 days without food. No one confessed. The mistress cried in front of guests, saying the servants had violated the home's peace. The master nodded gravely. Among themselves, the servants developed signals. A flick of the cloth meant, quiet. A tap of the tray meant, danger near. These were their own languages, designed for survival. In rare moments of rest, they gathered quietly near the back steps, sharing whatever was left from the kitchen, a scrap of bread, a bruised fruit. They never ate first, never sat fully down. Always half standing, half ready to move. It was there that Tommy once saw the old butler's hands. They were cracked and raw, fingers twisted from years of cold and labor. And yet the man poured tea with perfect grace. "They want us to look like part of the furniture," he whispered. "But we're the ones holding the roof up." That night, Ebony helped a younger girl hide a burned dress. She stitched it in silence under a candle, covering the scorch mark with a patch shaped like a leaf. It was the only beauty she could give in a place that demanded none. As weeks turned into months, the house servants became shadows with names, essential, yet never acknowledged beyond commands. They were referred to not as people, but as the help, the girl, or simply by first names, stripped of surnames, history, and presence. Ebony began to memorize the footsteps of each member of the household. The master's boots were heavy, paced. The mistress's shoes clicked sharply when she was angry. The children's light steps were the most dangerous. They could appear suddenly, and anything broken in their wake was blamed on whoever was nearby. The house was large, but it offered no space to hide. Every room had ears, every silence hid a test. The drawing room, with its plush chairs and delicate porcelain, was a minefield. One wrong move, a breath too loud, a glance too long, could cause a day of punishment. Once, Isoke was caught admiring a music box. She never touched anything again. Yet in the kitchen, after hours, stories lived. Quiet laughter under whispers, legends from back home, riddles traded like gold. These moments stitched the servants together like secret threads in a torn garment. There was a young boy named Kato, no more than 12, tasked with carrying hot coals to different rooms. His fingers were blistered and wrapped in cloth. He never cried. Once, Ebony asked him why. "If I cry, they think I'm weak. If I don't, they forget I'm human," he said, staring into the glowing ash. The library became Ebony's assigned space for dusting. She couldn't read, but she learned the weight of books, how pages smelled when they were old. One day, she found a torn page stuck between volumes, a letter from a previous servant, hidden away. It was only half legible, but it said, "They cannot break us if we remember who we were." Sometimes, the mistress's guests would praise the quiet elegance of the home, commenting on how well-trained the staff was. Ebony would bow slightly and say nothing, her hands aching, her stomach tight with hunger. The master's study held a locked drawer. All the servants knew it. Inside were ledgers, records of trade, profit, names. Their names. Ebony once caught a glimpse while delivering a tray. She saw her own name beside the words, "valued asset." She did not sleep that night. But hope, like dust, finds its way through the smallest cracks. Tommy began teaching letters to Kato in the pantry with coal on scraps of cloth. Isoke hummed songs at night, melodies once banned. Even silence became a form of protest, a refusal to forget. In the servants' quarters, there was an old mirror, slightly cracked. Ebony once stood before it and pulled herself upright. For a moment, she saw not a servant, but a woman whose story wasn't finished. Her eyes held not just sorrow, but defiance. There came a season when everything felt heavier, the air, the labor, the silence. The plantation was aging, like a creature fed too long on suffering. The house, once pristine, showed signs of neglect in corners the masters didn't notice, cracked baseboards, loosened hinges, and servants with spirits stretched too thin to speak. Ebony moved like breath, barely seen. Her face no longer changed when insulted. Her hands, cracked from years of soap and ash, never trembled. But beneath her silence was a storm waiting for its sky. One late evening, during supper, a guest from the north arrived, Mr. Horace, a wealthy abolitionist cousin, visiting, for a change of scenery. He dined with the family, commented on the well-kept house, and then asked the question no one expected. "Do your slaves ever speak to you of their dreams?" The room fell still. The master laughed, but it was nervous. The mistress smiled too tightly. Ebony, serving wine, paused, just long enough for the guest to notice. Later, Mr. Horace found Ebony in the hallway. He didn't speak to her as a servant, but as a person. "Do you have family?" he asked. "I had a sister," she said. He nodded, quiet. "I'll be leaving in 2 days. There may be options." Ebony didn't dare to hope. She'd heard such words before. They always blew away like dust in wind. But this time, something felt different. Mr. Horace left a folded letter inside a book on the library shelf, one Ebony dusted daily. It contained a contact, a free woman in Philadelphia. If she ever made it out, the letter could be her lifeline. Days later, a storm broke over the estate. Thunder shook the rafters, wind howled through shutters. The family was too distracted by the flooding barn to notice one missing servant. Ebony, cloaked in rags and fear, slipped past the boundary trees under rain as hard as fists. Isoak had helped. Tommy had distracted the overseer. Even Cato had loosened the back gate's lock. She ran until her legs gave out. And then she crawled. And then she waited, until a lantern's light appeared in the forest. A safe contact. A wagon. A whisper of the road north. In time, Ebony reached freedom. The letter led her to a woman named Lydia, who opened her home and gave her not just shelter, but the unheard of, a future. Ebony would never forget the faces she left behind. She wrote their names in charcoal every morning on paper scraps, so they would never vanish. Years later, she would teach children in a small school. On her wall, she hung the cracked mirror from the quarters. When students asked why, she would say, "It reminds me to never let others tell me who I am."